The advertisement in the Boston Chronicle had promised a rancher in need of a wife, and Grace Zimmerman had been desperate enough to answer it. But now, as she stood on the dusty platform of Silver City, New Mexico in the blazing August heat of 1881, watching a tall cowboy approach with skeptical eyes, she wondered if she had made the worst mistake of her 22 years. Xavier Thornton stopped 3 feet away, removing his worn Stetson to reveal sun-bleached brown hair and a face weathered by wind and sun. His green eyes traveled over her practical gray traveling dress and the single carpetbag at her feet with an expression that was neither welcoming nor hostile, merely assessing. Grace lifted her chin, determined not to show the fear churning in her stomach. "Miss Zimmerman." His voice was deep, rough like gravel. "Yes, Mr. Thornton, I presume," he nodded once, sharp and efficient. "Train was on time for once. You have more bags." "No, just this one." His eyebrows rose slightly, the first crack in his neutral expression. "You traveled all the way from Boston with 1 bag. I did not have much worth bringing." The truth was she had sold nearly everything she owned to afford the train ticket west after her father's debts had consumed their small boarding house. The few dresses and personal items in her bag represented the entirety of her worldly possessions. Xavier picked up her carpetbag without comment and gestured toward a wagon hitched nearby. "Ranch is about an hour outside town. We'll get supplies before heading out." Grace followed him through the dusty streets of Silver City, acutely aware of the curious stares from townspeople. The settlement was rough-hewn and practical, false-fronted buildings lining a wide main street, churned to powder by countless hooves and wagon wheels. Mountains rose in the distance, stark and beautiful against the endless blue sky. The general store smelled of coffee, leather, and salt pork. Xavier moved through the aisles with practiced efficiency, selecting items and adding them to the growing pile on the counter. Grace stood awkwardly near the door until the shopkeeper, a round woman with kind eyes, addressed her. "You must be the bride from back east. Welcome to Silver City, dear. I'm Martha Henderson." "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. I am pleased to meet you." Martha's smile faltered slightly. "I hope," Xavier explained the situation out at his ranch. "It's not an easy life, especially for a city woman." "I am prepared to work hard." Grace said it with more confidence than she felt. Xavier appeared beside them, arms loaded with supplies. "Martha, add flour, sugar, and coffee to the order." "Double what I usually take." "Planning to do more baking?" Martha asked with a knowing look. "Hoping to, anyway." Xavier glanced at Grace. "You can cook, I assume?" "Your letter mentioned household skills." Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the New Mexico sun. This was the moment of truth, the lie that had seemed so insignificant when she penned her response to his advertisement. "I should be honest with you, Mr. Thornton. I may have overstated my domestic abilities." His expression went carefully blank. "Meaning I cannot cook." "Or so, really. Not well, anyway." The words tumbled out in a rush. "My father ran a boarding house, but we employed a cook and a seamstress. I managed the books and handled correspondence and dealt with suppliers. I am excellent with figures and organization, but I never learned the traditional household arts." The silence that followed was suffocating. Martha Henderson looked between them with poorly concealed alarm. Xavier's jaw worked as if he were chewing on something bitter. "You lied in your letter," he said finally, his voice flat. "I misrepresented my skills," Grace corrected, lifting her chin. "I was desperate. My father died and left substantial debts. I would have been thrown into the street or worse. Your advertisement seemed like salvation, and I convinced myself that I could learn quickly once I arrived. I need a wife who can help run a household. I work dawn to dusk with the cattle and horses. I cannot come in from a 14-hour day to cook my own supper and mend my own clothes." "Then perhaps you need a servant, not a wife." The words were out before Grace could stop them, sharpened by exhaustion and fear and the defensive pride that had gotten her into trouble more than once. Xavier's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me, you heard me. You want someone to cook and clean and sew. You want a maid you do not have to pay. That is not a partnership, Mr. Thornton. That is servitude." Martha Henderson made a small sound of distress. Several other shoppers had stopped to listen, not even pretending to mind their own business. Grace knew she should stop talking, but something in Xavier's expectant, dismissive assessment had struck a nerve. "I may not know how to cook a proper meal, but I can balance books, manage inventory, negotiate with suppliers, and handle correspondence. I can read and write and cipher. I managed an entire boarding house for 3 years before my father died. If you need a wife who can be a true partner in building something, I can do that. If you just need someone to wash your shirts, put me back on the train." Xavier stared at her for a long moment, and Grace prepared herself for rejection. Instead, something shifted in his expression, a crack in the armor of his frustration. "You managed a boarding house. The whole operation, 19 rooms. My father was not well the last few years. I handled everything except the actual cooking and laundry, which we hired out." He rubbed his jaw, clearly thinking. "How are you with figures? Real accounting, not just household budgets." "I kept complete books for the boarding house. Double entry ledgers, profit and loss statements, accounts receivable and payable. I can show you letters of reference from our bank." Xavier glanced at Martha, who was watching with undisguised curiosity. He picked up Grace's carpetbag again. "Come on. We'll discuss this at the ranch." "Should I purchase return passage now?" Grace asked, pride warring with practicality. "No." He headed toward the door, then paused. "But I am not promising anything either. We'll see if we can find some kind of arrangement that works." The ride to Xavier's ranch was mostly silent, the wagon jolting over the rutted road while Grace held onto the bench seat and tried not to show her nervousness. The landscape was starkly beautiful, all rust-red earth and scattered sage, mountains rising in the distance like the spine of some sleeping giant. She had never seen so much open space, so much sky. "Why did you advertise for a bride?" she asked finally, unable to bear the silence any longer. Xavier kept his eyes on the road ahead. "I have been building this ranch for 6 years. Started with nothing but a land claim and 50 head of cattle. Now I have got 500 head, contracts to provide beef to the army posts, and enough horses that I started breeding them seriously. But I cannot expand any further alone. I need help, not just with the work but with the business side. Someone to handle the paperwork while I handle the animals. But you wanted a cook and a seamstress. I wanted a wife, someone who could make a home while helping build an enterprise. Maybe that is too much to ask for." There was no rancor in his voice now, just tired honesty. Grace absorbed this. "What if I learned to cook? Not well, perhaps, but adequately. Can you learn? I learned accounting and business management. Surely I can learn to fry eggs and make coffee." The corner of his mouth twitched. "You would think so, but some people just do not have the knack." "I am not an idiot, Mr. Thornton. Didn't say you were. But knowing that butter and sugar and flour make a cake and actually being able to make a decent cake are two different things." He glanced at her. "What happened when you tried to cook back in Boston?" Grace winced at the memory. "There was an incident with a kettle and some rather unfortunate circumstances involving smoke, but that was years ago. Did the fire brigade have to come? That is not relevant." Xavier made a sound that might have been a laugh. "That is what I thought." The ranch house came into view over a rise, and Grace felt her stomach drop. It was not exactly a house, more a large cabin with a covered porch, built of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney. A barn and several outbuildings stood nearby, corrals spreading out from there. It was rustic and isolated, miles from anywhere. Not what you expected, Xavier asked, reading her expression. I did not know what to expect, Grace admitted. It is very remote. Nearest neighbors are 5 miles south. Town is an hour in good weather, longer when it rains. It is a hard life out here, Miss Zimmerman. I won't lie about that. You would be alone a lot while I am working the ranch. He pulled the wagon up in front of the house and jumped down, then came around to help her descend. His hands were strong and calloused when they gripped her waist, lifting her down as if she weighed nothing. Grace felt an unexpected flutter in her chest at the contact. The interior of the house was as rustic as the exterior, but clean and better organized than she had expected. One large main room served as kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and a simple kitchen along another. 2 doors led to what she assumed were bedrooms. The furniture was handmade but sturdy, the floor swept clean. I have been living alone for 3 years, Xavier said, following her gaze. I keep things orderly, but it is not exactly refined. It is better than I feared, Grace said honestly. She turned to face him. Mr. Thornton, I think we should speak plainly about our situation. You need help with your ranch. I need a home and a livelihood. We are both adults. Perhaps we can come to some arrangement that benefits us both without pretending this is a traditional marriage. Xavier set her bag down and leaned against the table, crossing his arms. What kind of arrangement? A business partnership. I will handle all the paperwork, accounting, correspondence, and business dealings. I will learn to cook basic meals and maintain the household. In exchange, you provide room and board and a share in the ranch's success. We can marry legally to satisfy propriety, but as partners, not as master and servant. And if it does not work out, then we dissolve the partnership honestly. I am not trying to trap you, Mr. Thornton. I am trying to survive with my dignity intact. He studied her for a long moment, those green eyes assessing. Grace forced herself to stand still under the scrutiny, to project confidence she did not entirely feel. All right, he said finally. We will try it. 3 months to see if we can make it work as partners. If either of us wants out after that, we arrange a divorce or an annulment, and I provide enough money for you to establish yourself somewhere. Fair, fair. Grace extended her hand. Should we shake on it? Xavier's hand engulfed hers, warm and rough. Deal, Miss Zimmerman. Though if we are going to be married, you should probably call me Xavier. Grace, she replied. When did you want to have the ceremony? Might as well go into town tomorrow and get it done. No point waiting. The casual practicality of it should have been depressing, but instead Grace felt relief. This was honest, at least. A business arrangement between 2 people who needed each other. She could work with that. Xavier showed her to the smaller bedroom, which contained a narrow bed, a dresser, and little else. This was my room until last month. I have been sleeping in the main bedroom, but you should have it. I can move my things back in here. We are not going to share a room. The question came out more uncertain than she intended. Not unless we decide we want to. Like you said, this is a partnership, not a traditional marriage. At least not yet. Something in his tone made her cheeks warm. That night, Grace lay in the unfamiliar bed and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling around her. Horses whickered in the corrals. The wind whispered through gaps in the walls. From the other bedroom came the sound of Xavier moving around, the creak of his bed as he settled. She had expected to be married someday, though not like this. She had imagined love and courtship and all the romantic notions young women entertained. Instead, she had a business arrangement with a stranger in the wilds of New Mexico territory. But she was safe, and she had a chance to prove her worth as something other than a cook or a seamstress. That was more than she had a week ago. They rode to town the next morning in relative silence. Grace wore her best dress, a deep blue cotton that brought out her eyes, and had twisted her honey blonde hair into a respectable bun. Xavier had cleaned up as well, his jaw freshly shaven and his shirt relatively free of dust. The wedding itself was perfunctory, performed by a weary justice of the peace in his cramped office above the general store. Martha Henderson and her husband served as witnesses, Martha dabbing at her eyes despite the obvious lack of romance in the proceedings. Grace repeated her vows in a steady voice, and Xavier did the same, and then it was done. They were married. "You should kiss your bride," Martha prompted when Xavier seemed ready to leave without that particular tradition. He glanced at Grace, a question in his eyes. She gave a small nod. His kiss was brief and chaste, his lips warm and slightly chapped against hers. It was her first kiss, and it was over before she could really register the sensation. "Congratulations," Martha said, enveloping Grace in a sudden hug. "You come to town if you need anything, dear. And do not let him work you too hard." "I will not," Xavier said dryly. "Since she already told me she cannot cook or sew, I figure my expectations are already low enough." Martha swatted his arm. "Do not be difficult, Xavier Thornton. You got yourself a smart wife. That is worth more than a dozen good meals." They purchased supplies and headed back to the ranch, now husband and wife in the eyes of the law if nothing else. Grace found herself stealing glances at Xavier as he drove, trying to reconcile the stern, practical rancher with the man she was now bound to. "What do you want me to work on first?" she asked as they approached the ranch. "Can you actually ride a horse?" "I have ridden, yes. In Central Park. On very tame horses." Xavier made that almost laugh sound again. "Of course you have. All right, tomorrow I will teach you to ride properly. Today I need to show you the books and the current business situation. You should know what you have gotten yourself into." The ranch office was really just a corner of the main room with a battered desk and a cabinet overflowing with papers. Xavier pulled out ledgers and correspondence, and Grace felt her fingers itch to organize the chaos. The numbers told a story of steady growth and surprising profit, but the organization was haphazard at best. "You are doing well," she said, scanning the figures. "Better than I expected, honestly. But you are losing money on inefficient practices. These feed costs are too high. You could negotiate better rates with a contract, and I see you are selling to the Army through a middleman who is taking a substantial cut. You could contract directly and increase your profit by at least 20%. Xavier leaned over her shoulder, close enough that she could smell soap and leather and something distinctly masculine. "You got all that from an hour of looking at the books. It is what I do, what I did anyway." She pointed to another line. "And you are undercharging for your horses." "I know the market rates, Xavier. These animals are worth double what you are asking. I do not want to price myself out of the market. You will not. Quality stock commands premium prices. If your horses are as good as these figures suggest, you are leaving money on the table." He pulled up a chair beside her, suddenly intent. "Show me." They spent the rest of the afternoon going through the books, Grace explaining her reasoning and Xavier providing context about the actual ranching operations. It was the first real conversation they had, and Grace found herself relaxing into the familiar rhythm of numbers and analysis. This was her element. This she could do. "You really are good at this," Xavier said as the light began to fade. "I had no idea I was losing so much through poor negotiations." "You are not a businessman, you are a rancher. There is no shame in that. But together, we could make this operation significantly more profitable." Grace felt a flicker of excitement, the first real hope since arriving in New Mexico. I could handle all the contract negotiations, the correspondence with buyers, the financial planning. You focus on the cattle and horses. A real partnership, Xavier said, meeting her eyes. A real partnership, Grace agreed. He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his weathered face. I think maybe we can make this work, Grace. The next morning, Xavier kept his promise to teach her to ride. He saddled a gentle mare named Rosie and led Grace to the corral. The stirrups felt strange beneath her feet, and the ground seemed much farther away than it had on those sedate Central Park rides. Relax, Xavier instructed, his hand steadying her knee. Rosie can feel your tension. She is as gentle as they come, but you have to trust her. I am trying, Grace said through gritted teeth. Here, let me show you. Xavier mounted his own horse, a big bay gelding with fluid grace. He demonstrated the proper posture, the way to hold the reins, the subtle signals that told the horse what you wanted. Grace watched, trying to absorb everything. They spent an hour in the corral before Xavier deemed her ready to venture beyond the fence. The ranch land spread out before them, vast and open, and despite her nervousness, Grace felt a thrill of exhilaration. The wind caught at her hair, pulling strands loose from their pins. The sun was warm on her face. You are doing well, Xavier called, riding beside her. Better than I expected for a city woman. I am adaptable, Grace called back, and was rewarded with another of those rare smiles. Over the following weeks, they settled into a rhythm. Grace rose early and attempted breakfast, producing meals that ranged from barely edible to surprisingly decent with Xavier's patient instruction. She discovered that cooking was indeed more art than science, requiring intuition she was still developing. But she improved slowly, and Xavier never complained. Even about the morning, the biscuits came out hard enough to serve as ammunition. After breakfast, Xavier would head out to work the ranch while Grace tackled the mounting paperwork. She organized the chaotic filing system, updated the ledgers, and began drafting letters to potential buyers and suppliers. In the afternoons, she would ride out to find Xavier and learn about the actual ranching operations. He taught her to recognize different breeds of cattle, to spot signs of illness or injury, to understand the rhythms of the ranch. She was not strong enough for much of the physical labor, but she learned to help where she could. Her hands, soft from years of desk work, developed blisters that hardened into calluses. Her pale skin tanned despite her best efforts. She lost the last softness of city life and discovered muscles she had not known she possessed. One evening, 3 weeks after their wedding, Xavier came in to find Grace hunched over the desk, working by lamplight. You will ruin your eyes, he said, setting down a bucket of fresh water. Just finishing this letter to the quartermaster at Fort Bayard. I think I can negotiate a better contract for the beef supply. She signed the letter with a flourish and set down her pen. Xavier, I have been thinking. You need to expand your horse breeding operation. The profit margins are much better than cattle, and you have the bloodstock to build a real reputation. He settled into the chair across from her, still dusty from the day's work. I have thought about it, but it requires more capital upfront, and more expertise than I have, really. What if we brought in a partner, someone who knows horses and has access to quality breeding stock? Grace pulled out another ledger. I have been corresponding with a breeder in Colorado who might be interested. He would provide the breeding expertise and some capital in exchange for a percentage of the profits. Xavier leaned forward, interested despite his obvious exhaustion. Tell me more. They talked late into the night, planning and strategizing, and Grace realized she was happy. This strange arrangement, this business partnership masquerading as marriage, had become something she looked forward to each day. Xavier was a good man, she had discovered, honest and fair and surprisingly patient with her many shortcomings in the domestic sphere. He listened to her ideas and respected her intelligence, never dismissing her suggestions because she was a woman or an Easterner. And if she sometimes found herself noticing the way his shirt stretched across his shoulders, or the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, well, that was her own business. The first real test of their partnership came in early September. A buyer from Fort Bayard arrived to inspect the cattle Xavier had contracted to provide. Major William Preston was a hard-faced career soldier with little patience for what he clearly viewed as frontier incompetence. "Thornton," he said by way of greeting, barely glancing at Grace. "I am here to inspect the cattle and finalize our contract. Of course, Major, my wife will handle the contract details while we look at the herd." Xavier gestured to Grace. Preston's expression suggested he had just been asked to negotiate with a particularly dim-witted child. "Your wife?" "Yes. Grace handles all the business operations for the ranch. She will discuss terms with you." "I think I would prefer to discuss terms with you, Thornton." Grace felt Xavier stiffen beside her. She put a hand on his arm. "It is all right. Major Preston, why don't we review the proposed contract while Xavier shows your men the cattle? I think you will find our terms quite favorable." Preston looked ready to argue, but protocol won out. He followed Grace to the house, his posture radiating skepticism. She spread the contract documents on the table and began walking him through the details, pointing out the quality guarantees, delivery schedules, and pricing structure. "This is below market rate," Preston said, pointing to a figure. "That was the price quoted 2 months ago. Market rates have increased since then due to drought conditions in Texas. I have taken the liberty of adjusting our price to reflect current conditions while still offering you a better rate than you would get from other suppliers." Grace slid another sheet across the table. "As you can see from this comparison," Preston studied the figures, his expression shifting from condescension to grudging respect. "You have done your research. I believe in being thorough, Major. The Army needs reliable beef supply, and we can provide that at a fair price. But we will not be taken advantage of simply because we are a small operation." They negotiated for 2 hours, Grace holding firm on the points that mattered while showing flexibility on lesser issues. When Xavier and the soldiers returned from inspecting the herd, the contract was finalized with terms significantly better than what Xavier had originally hoped for. "Pleasure doing business with you, Mrs. Thornton," Preston said as he prepared to leave. "I admit, I had my doubts. But you certainly know your way around a contract." After they had gone, Xavier swept Grace into an impulsive hug. "You were magnificent. Did you see his face when you corrected him about the market rates?" Grace laughed, surprised by the embrace and by how good it felt to be held by him. "He was not expecting a woman to know business." "Then he is a fool." Xavier pulled back, his hands still on her shoulders, his eyes bright with excitement and something else she could not quite name. "Grace, you just secured double what I thought we could get. This changes everything. We can expand, we can invest in better breeding stock, we can." He stopped, seeming to realize how close they were standing. His hands dropped to his sides. "Sorry, I got carried away. Do not apologize." Grace felt breathless, aware of her heart hammering in her chest. "We are partners. Your success is my success." But as she watched him walk away, she wondered if partnership was all she wanted anymore. The incident with Major Preston shifted something between them. Xavier began deferring to her judgment on all business matters, and Grace found herself increasingly integrated into every aspect of ranch operations. She learned to treat minor horse injuries, to keep watch while Xavier broke a new colt, to recognize the signs of an approaching storm. They began eating meals together instead of taking them separately. Xavier would talk about his day, and Grace would share what she had been working on. Sometimes they would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun paint the mountains gold and red, and talk about their plans for the ranch's future. One night in late September, Grace was attempting to mend a tear in Xavier's shirt, her stitches crooked but determined. He watched her struggle with barely concealed amusement. "You really cannot sew," he observed. "I told you that from the beginning," Grace said, jabbing her finger with the needle for the third time. "Damn it! Here." Xavier took the shirt from her hands and completed the repair with efficient, even stitches. "My mother taught me before she died. Said a man alone on the frontier needed to know how to take care of himself." Grace watched his hands move, fascinated by this unexpected skill. "What was she like?" "Your mother, strong, tough as old leather but kind with it. She and my father came west in a wagon train, staked a claim in Colorado. She died when I was 15. Pneumonia. My father followed her 2 years later. I think he just gave up without her." Xavier tied off the thread and bit it clean. "That is when I came to New Mexico, wanted a fresh start. I am sorry." Grace's voice was soft. "It must have been hard losing them both so young." "It was a long time ago." But his eyes held old grief. "What about your family? You never talk about them." Grace set aside her own mending attempt. "There is not much to tell. My mother died when I was born. It was just my father and me. He loved me, I think, in his way, but he was weak. He gambled, made bad investments, borrowed from the wrong people. When he died, I discovered he had mortgaged everything, including the boarding house that had been my mother's family property. The debts were staggering. That is why you answered my advertisement. That is why I lied about being able to cook and sew, yes." Grace smiled wryly. "I convinced myself the deception was justified." "I am glad you did," Xavier said quietly. "Lie, I mean. If you had been honest, I probably would not have chosen you, and I would have missed out on the best thing that has happened to this ranch in 6 years. Their eyes met across the small space, and Grace felt something shift, like a door opening onto a room she had been afraid to enter. Xavier reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "Grace, I need to tell you something." Before he could continue, the sound of galloping hooves shattered the moment. Xavier was on his feet instantly, hand dropping to the pistol he kept by the door. Grace grabbed the rifle from above the mantel, her heart pounding. A rider burst into the yard, his horse lathered and wild-eyed. Xavier relaxed fractionally. "That is Tom Kelsey from the bar, Kay. Something is wrong." He threw open the door. "Tom, what happened?" The young cowboy half fell from his horse. "Mr. Thornton, thank God, it is rustlers. They hit our herd last night, ran off near 100 head. My pa sent me to warn you and to ride for the sheriff. They might be heading this way." Xavier's expression hardened. "How many?" 6, maybe 7. "Well armed and mean. They shot Ben Tucker when he tried to stop them. He is alive, but it is bad." Grace felt cold fear grip her chest. Cattle rustling was no small crime. Men had been killed over less. "I will ride with you to warn the other ranchers," Xavier said. "Grace, you need to stay inside, keep the rifle close. If anyone comes near the house that you do not know, you shoot first and ask questions after." "I am going with you," Grace said. "Absolutely not." "Xavier, you cannot round up help and watch your own back at the same time. You need someone with you." She checked the rifle with hands that only shook slightly. "I can shoot. My father insisted I learn after we had a break-in at the boarding house. Grace, we are partners, remember? That means in danger as well as profit." Xavier looked like he wanted to argue, but Tom was already back in his saddle, anxious to move. "We are wasting time," the young man said. "Fine," Xavier bit out. "But you stay close to me and do exactly what I say. Promise me." "I promise." They rode hard through the gathering darkness, warning neighboring ranchers and organizing a group to ride for the sheriff in Silver City. By the time they returned to Xavier's ranch, it was past midnight and Grace was exhausted, her legs aching from hours in the saddle. Xavier was gentle as he helped her down from Rosie. "You did well tonight. You kept your head." "I was terrified," Grace admitted. "So was I." "That is what keeping your head means." His arms were still around her waist, and neither of them seemed inclined to move apart. "Grace, what I was trying to say before Tom arrived, this arrangement of ours, this partnership, I do not want it to be just business anymore." Grace's breath caught. "What do you want it to be? A real marriage, if you are willing." His voice was rough with emotion. "I know this is not what either of us planned, but somewhere over the past month I stopped thinking of you as a business partner and started thinking of you as my wife. My real wife." "Xavier, you do not have to answer now. I know I am not much of a catch, a rough rancher with few social graces and less money. But I swear to you, Grace, I would spend every day trying to make you happy, trying to be worthy of you." Grace reached up and cupped his face in her hands, feeling the rough stubble of his jaw. "You foolish man. Do you not know I have been half in love with you for weeks? Every time you patiently taught me to cook eggs without burning them, every time you listened to my ideas like they mattered, every time you smiled at me like I was something precious. I did not come west looking for love, but I found it anyway. The kiss was nothing like their chaste wedding peck. It was deep and searching, full of weeks of denied longing." Xavier's arms tightened around her and Grace pressed against him, learning the taste and feel of him. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, his eyes held wonder. "I want a real marriage," Grace whispered. "With you." "In every way." Xavier kissed her again, softer this time, reverent. "Are you sure?" "I have never been more sure of anything." He swept her into his arms, carrying her toward the house, and Grace laughed with pure joy, no longer caring that she could not cook or sew, knowing that what she could offer was exactly what he needed and what she needed in return. They were partners in the truest sense, and everything else would follow. The bedroom was dark, lit only by the moonlight streaming through the window. Xavier set Grace down gently, his hands trembling slightly as they found the buttons of her dress. She helped him, suddenly shy but determined. This was her choice, her husband, her future. "I have never done this before," she whispered as her dress pooled at her feet. "Neither have I," Xavier admitted. "We will figure it out together, like everything else." And they did, with tenderness and fumbling inexperience that gave way to passion. Xavier was gentle with her, patient despite his obvious desire, and Grace discovered that this physical union was another kind of partnership. A conversation conducted in touches and whispered endearments and gasped breath. When it was over, she lay in his arms, feeling cherished and claimed and fundamentally changed. "I love you," Xavier murmured against her hair. "I do not think I knew what that meant before you." "I love you too." Grace traced patterns on his chest, marveling at the solid reality of him. "Even though you are a terrible accountant," his laugh rumbled under her ear, "and even though you are a terrible cook, I am improving. You are. Last week's stew was almost edible." She swatted his chest and he caught her hand, kissing her fingers. They fell asleep tangled together, and when Grace woke in the early dawn, it was to find Xavier watching her with such open affection that her heart ached with it. "Good morning, wife," he said. "Good morning, husband." They rose and dressed, falling into the familiar morning routine but with new awareness of each other. Grace made breakfast while Xavier tended the stock, and if the eggs were slightly overdone, Neither of them cared. They were building something here, something that had started as desperation and convenience, but had become real and precious. The threat of the rustlers hung over the next few days. The sheriff and a posse from Silver City patrolled the area, and ranchers took turns keeping watch over each other's herds. Xavier spent long hours out with the cattle, and Grace kept the rifle close, jumping at every sound. On the third day, word came that the rustlers had been caught trying to cross into Arizona territory. There had been a shootout. 2 of the outlaws were dead, the rest in custody, and all the stolen cattle had been recovered. The danger was over. That night, Xavier came home looking wrung out but relieved. Grace met him at the door, and he pulled her into a fierce embrace. "It is done," he said. "We are safe." "We are," Grace agreed, holding him tight. "We are safe, and we have each other, and the ranch is doing well." "We are going to be all right, Xavier. Better than all right." He pulled back to look at her. "I got a letter today from that horse breeder in Colorado you have been corresponding with. He wants to come down next month to discuss a partnership." Grace felt excitement bubble up. "That is wonderful. If we can bring him on board, we could have one of the premier breeding operations in the territory within 5 years. Listen to you, talking like a real rancher." Xavier kissed her soundly. What happened to the city woman who showed up 6 weeks ago scared of her own shadow? She found something worth being brave for. Over the following months, the ranch flourished under their joint management. The horse breeder from Colorado, a grizzled veteran named Samuel Hart, came to inspect the operation and was impressed enough to invest capital and expertise. Grace negotiated a contract that gave the ranch the majority control while benefiting from Hart's reputation and connections. Xavier's herd grew, and so did his horse breeding program. Grace handled all the business correspondence, freeing Xavier to focus on what he did best. She still could not sew worth a damn, and her cooking remained merely adequate, but it no longer mattered. She was proving her worth in ways that had nothing to do with traditional domestic skills. Martha Henderson became a good friend, visiting regularly and teaching Grace what she could about cooking and preserving. The older woman seemed delighted that the unlikely marriage was working out. "I had my doubts when I first saw you two," Martha admitted one afternoon over tea. "You seemed so mismatched. But Xavier is happier than I have ever seen him, and you have bloomed out here, Grace. You were meant for this life." Grace looked around the rough cabin that had become home, thinking of the partnership that had become love. "I think you are right. I never expected to find this kind of happiness. I thought I was just escaping Boston. Instead, I found exactly where I belonged." Winter came to New Mexico with sharp winds and occasional snow. Grace discovered she was pregnant in December, and when she told Xavier, his whoop of joy could probably be heard in Silver City. He became impossibly protective, trying to prevent her from doing anything more strenuous than breathing. "Xavier Thornton, I am pregnant, not made of glass," Grace protested when he tried to carry her to bed for the 3rd night in a row. "You are carrying my child. Let me take care of you. You can take care of me by letting me continue to work. The baby is not due until summer." "I am not going to sit idle for 7 months. They compromised. Grace continued to handle the business operations but agreed to reduce her riding and limit her time in the saddle. As her belly grew, she found herself oddly content with the slower pace. She organized the entire filing system, wrote a comprehensive business plan for the next 5 years, and even managed to sew together a few crude baby garments under Martha's patient instruction. Spring came with wildflowers and the birth of dozens of foals and calves. Grace watched Xavier work with the new horses, his patience and skill evident in every movement. He would make a wonderful father, she thought. Firm but gentle, teaching by example rather than harsh words. One evening in April, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Xavier placed his hand on her swollen belly and felt the baby kick. "Strong," he said with satisfaction. "Takes after his mother." "It could be a girl," Grace pointed out. "Then she will be strong like her mother and hopefully better at cooking." Xavier grinned at Grace's mock outrage. "I am joking, mostly. I have improved considerably. Last week's bread was quite good." "It was. You are learning, slowly but learning." Grace leaned against him, content. "We make a good team, you and I." "The best," Xavier agreed. "I still cannot believe you answered my advertisement. Best piece of luck I ever had." "I thought I was being dishonest, lying about my skills, but maybe I was just being honest about the things that really mattered. I could not offer you traditional domestic skills, but I could offer partnership. Turns out that was what you really needed." "What we both needed," Xavier corrected. He kissed her temple. "A partner, not a servant. You were right about that from the beginning." Their son was born in early July, during a hot spell that had Grace miserable and exhausted. The labor was long and difficult, with Martha Henderson attending as midwife. Xavier paced outside, looking more terrified than Grace had ever seen him, even facing down rustlers. When Martha finally emerged with the baby wrapped in a blanket, Xavier practically snatched the bundle from her hands. "You have a son," Martha said, beaming, "and Grace is doing well, tired but well." Xavier stared down at the tiny red face of his child, his expression stunned. "He is perfect." "He is loud," Martha said as the baby began to wail. "Better get him to his mother before he wakes the dead." Grace lay propped up in bed, exhausted but triumphant. When Xavier placed their son in her arms, she felt a surge of love so intense it almost hurt. This was her family. This home, this man, this child. Everything she had never dared to hope for. "What should we name him?" Xavier asked, settling beside her on the bed. "I was thinking Thomas, after my grandfather. Thomas Xavier Thornton. I like that, Tommy." Xavier touched the baby's tiny hand, watching in wonder as miniature fingers curled around his rough one. "Thank you." "For what?" "For being brave enough to come west, for lying about your cooking, for agreeing to be my partner." Xavier's voice was rough with emotion. "For giving me a family. Thank you for seeing past what I could not do to what I could do, for treating me as an equal, for loving me." Grace smiled up at him, tired but happier than she had ever been. "We built something good here, Xavier. We did, and we are not done building yet." The years that followed were full and rich. The ranch prospered beyond their initial dreams. Grace's business acumen and Xavier's ranching skill proved an unbeatable combination. Within 3 years, the Thornton Ranch was one of the most successful operations in the territory, known for quality cattle and exceptional horses. Tommy grew into a sturdy boy with his father's green eyes and his mother's stubborn determination. Grace discovered that motherhood came more naturally to her than cooking, though she never did master the art of sewing. She hired a seamstress in Silver City for major projects, declaring that some skills were simply not worth the struggle. When Tommy was 2, Grace gave birth to twin girls, Emma and Sarah. Xavier was in heaven with 3 healthy children, teaching Tommy to ride before the boy could barely walk and doting on his daughters with shameless favoritism. The ranch house was expanded twice, growing from a simple cabin to a proper house with multiple bedrooms, a separate office for Grace, and even a parlor for entertaining the increasing number of business associates who came to call. Grace decorated it with items that mixed Eastern refinement with Western practicality, creating a home that was uniquely theirs. Martha Henderson remained a close friend, and Grace sponsored her son's education back east, repaying the kindness and support the older woman had shown her in those early uncertain days. Other ranching families became friends as well, creating a community in the vast open spaces. Grace never forgot that she had come west as a desperate woman fleeing her father's debts, willing to lie to secure a future. But she had found so much more than security. She had found purpose, love, and a partnership that fulfilled her in ways she had never imagined. Xavier never let her forget that she could not cook or sew when she arrived. It became a family joke, the story told and retold of how Mama had nearly set the house on fire trying to make breakfast on her second day at the ranch. Grace would laugh and point out that Papa could not add two numbers together without getting confused, and they would both admit that it was their differences that made them strong. On their 10th anniversary, Xavier took Grace to the ridge overlooking the ranch. The house sat in the valley below, surrounded by corrals full of fine horses and pastures dotted with cattle. Children played in the yard, their laughter carrying on the wind. "I never could have built this without you," Xavier said, his arm around her waist. "Not just the business side, though God knows I would have gone bankrupt within 5 years, but the family, the home, the life. You gave me all of this." Grace leaned into him, still finding comfort and excitement in his embrace after all these years. "We built it together. That is what partners do." "Partners," Xavier agreed. "Not master and servant, not employer and employee. Real partners in every way that matters." "I love you," Grace said, simple and true. "I loved you when I thought this was just a business arrangement. I loved you when I realized it was becoming something more. I love you now, after 10 years and 3 children and more happiness than I ever thought possible." Xavier turned her to face him, his hands cupping her face with the same tenderness he had shown on their wedding night and every night since. "And I love you, my wife, my partner, my best friend. The woman who could not cook or sew but who gave me everything that truly mattered." Their kiss held 10 years of partnership, of struggles overcome and triumphs shared, of love that had grown from expedience to something deep and unshakable. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. "We should get back," Grace said, glancing at the sun. "Martha is watching the children, and I promised not to leave her alone with all 3 for more than an hour." "They can wait 5 more minutes," Xavier said, kissing her again. "I am not done appreciating my wife." Grace laughed and kissed him back, thinking of the advertisement she had answered so long ago, the desperate lies she had told, and the unexpected truth she had found. She had come west as a fraud, claiming skills she did not possess. Instead, she had proven that the skills she did have, her intelligence and determination and willingness to work as an equal partner, were exactly what was needed. They walked back down to the ranch hand in hand, to the house they had built, and the family they had created, and the life they were still building together. Grace's cooking never did get beyond adequate, and her sewing remained a family joke, but none of it mattered. She had proven that a partnership was worth more than perfection, that honesty about your weaknesses could be stronger than pretending to strengths you did not have. And most of all, she had proven that sometimes the best things in life come not from careful planning but from desperate chances, not from being what others expect, but from being exactly who you are. Xavier had not needed a servant. He had needed a partner. And Grace had discovered that she could be exactly that, in ways neither of them had anticipated. As the sun set over the New Mexico mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Grace stood on her porch with Xavier's arm around her shoulders and watched their children play. This was her life now, built on honesty after initial deception, on partnership that had grown into love, on the simple truth that 2 people working together could create something neither could have built alone. She had come west unable to cook or sew, and she had found a man who said he needed a partner, not a servant. Together, they had proven that love built on respect and equality was stronger than any traditional arrangement. And as their children's laughter filled the evening air, and Xavier pressed a kiss to her hair, Grace knew that she had found exactly where she belonged. The mail-order bride who could not cook or sew had become the heart of a successful ranch, not because she learned to do what was expected, but because she had the courage to offer what she actually could do. And the cowboy who thought he needed a traditional wife had discovered that what he really needed was someone who could stand beside him as an equal, sharing both burdens and triumphs. In the end, it was not the things Grace could not do that mattered. It was the things she could do, the partnership she offered, and the love they built together that transformed a desperate arrangement into a life worth living. And as the stars began to appear in the vast New Mexico sky, Grace Thornton held her husband's hand and knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do, with exactly the person she was meant to love. Years later, when their children were grown and starting ranches of their own, Grace and Xavier would sit on that same porch and remember the day she arrived in Silver City with one carpetbag and a head full of lies. They would laugh about the terrible meals and the crooked stitches, and the shocked look on his face when she admitted she could not do any of the things she had claimed. And then they would look at the empire they had built, not with needles and pots but with ledgers and contracts and partnership, and they would know that honesty, even when it comes after deception, is always the right choice. Love built on truth and respect lasts longer than love built on pretense. And sometimes, the best thing you can offer someone is not what they think they need, but what they actually need. Grace had offered Xavier partnership. He had given her the same in return. And together, they had built not just a successful ranch but a true home, filled with love and laughter and the kind of happiness that comes from being truly seen and valued for exactly who you are. The mail-order bride who could not cook or sew had found her place in the world. And the cowboy who needed a partner, not a servant, had found exactly that and so much more. Their story became legend in Silver City, told and retold as proof that sometimes the best marriages are the ones that start with honesty about limitations and grow into partnerships that exceed all expectations. As the evening drew in and Xavier pulled Grace close, both of them gray-haired now but still very much in love, they knew that they had beaten the odds. They had taken a desperate arrangement and turned it into something beautiful. They had proven that partnership matters more than perfection, that honesty is stronger than pretense, and that love, real love, is built on respect and equality and the willingness to value your partner for who they truly are. And if Grace still could not cook anything more complicated than basic meals, and if her sewing remained a disaster, well, that was just part of the story. The story of a woman who came west with nothing but her wits and her courage, and a man who was wise enough to see that those were exactly the qualities he needed. Together, they had built a legacy that would endure for generations, proving that the best partnerships are the ones where both people bring their true selves, limitations and all, and work together to create something neither could have achieved alone.